If you remember a few weeks back, we talked about the obedience of Daniel. And when we talked about the obedience of Daniel, we read over here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Actually, specifically, we read these exact same verses. And when we looked at it, we saw that there indeed is a reward for those who are obedient unto God. This morning, we're going to look at these same verses as we begin, but we're going to be able to see something else that Paul is bringing up here. So let's read here, beginning in verse 24. It says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." When we look up there in the very first verse, Paul says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run?" And what we see here when we read throughout this is that Paul is indeed comparing our spiritual life, our walk in this world, to a race. I started thinking about that. Started thinking about the fact that he's comparing this to a race that we're running, and I realized something. That requires endurance, doesn't it? It doesn't matter what type of race we're running. It doesn't really matter what type of physical activity we're doing, if it's rock climbing like we have up there, or if it's running a race that's 5 miles or 3 or 2 or 1.5, those kill me, we all know that. Or even if it's just a 100-meter sprint. It requires us to have endurance. This morning, that's what I want to look at. But in looking at endurance, I want to look at endurance like Joseph. Can we say that we have endurance like Joseph? And we're going to look at what that means. We're going to look at what I'm going to refer to as brick walls. And when I say that, I mean that with the thought of you're running a race and you hit this brick wall where you feel like you can't go any further. And the fact is that we have to endure through it. And then we're going to look at how did Joseph overcome these. Then we're going to look at our brick walls. And finally, we're going to look at how do we overcome them. So let's begin. Let's look at Joseph and his brick walls, or should I really say what could have been his brick walls, because we realized they really weren't for him. So what could have been his brick walls? Let's turn over to Genesis chapter 37. To understand the brick walls of Joseph, you have to realize something else about him at the very beginning. You have to realize when we read here in verses 3 and 4, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was a son of his old age, and he also made him a tunic of many colors." Let's stop there just for a second. When we talk about what Joseph is going to deal with, Joseph didn't always deal with these things. As Joseph was being raised as a young child, Joseph was indeed the favorite of his father. Anybody here the favorite of their parents? I know parents say they don't have favorites, and we all know that's not true. Is anybody here the favorite of their parents, that things just become a little bit easier? I know for me, when I was with my grandparents, nobody will deny that I was the favorite of my grandpa. And you know what? It was easy. I still got disciplined a lot, but it was easy because he loved me. You know, when we look at Joseph, we also see, though, that while he was a favorite of his father, we see that he was hated by his brothers. Hated by his brothers so much so that they sold him. Turn over to Genesis chapter 37 and going down a few verses. Remember, their plan was to kill him. But one of Joseph's brothers, Reuben to be specific, spoke up and he said, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. They sold him to the Ishmaelites, but if it's not bad enough that he's sold to the Ishmaelites, then the Ishmaelites turn around and they sell him. And they sell him into slavery in Egypt. To who? Potiphar. We see that when we look in 39 verse 1. You see, Joseph faces these things, and as he's facing them, I think any of us could look and say, wow, he really had to deal with a lot of stuff. I mean, being sold after being sold, being put into a pit, being brought up out of the pit, being the favorite of his dad, but being hated by his brother. He really did deal with a lot of stuff already. But you know what? We can go even further and look after he was Potiphar's slave. We look in there, we see in chapter 39, verse 14, that everything wasn't just easy at that point. Chapter 39, verse 14, it says there that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, this is Potiphar's wife, remember? And remember, what she's calling to them about is that she tried to entice Joseph to lie with her. Joseph denied and he fled, but what is her story? What does she say here? She says that she called the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. You know, not only does Joseph have to deal with Potiphar's wife trying to entice him in this way, but now we find that Potiphar's wife is lying about Joseph, about what Joseph didn't do. And we see that when that happens, that now Joseph is going to be put into prison. We see that when we go down to verse 20. And then Joseph's master took him, put him into a prison, in a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Why did he do that? Because of the story that his wife told him. You see, we look at all these things going on in his life, and if that's not bad enough, after he's in prison, he goes and he does what? He interprets the dream. These two dreams. And the chief butler tells him, I will not forget you in front of Pharaoh. But what does he do? He forgets him in front of Pharaoh, doesn't he? Initially. We see this happening and all these things going on, how hard it really must have been, or really could have been for Joseph, but yet that's not really what we see. He had a hard life, he dealt with a lot of things, but Joseph consistently was able to endure through them. No matter what came his way, no matter what happened, Joseph consistently was able to get through these things. Why? Why was he able to deal with these things that so many people would have been like, that's enough for me, I'm done with this? And that wasn't Joseph. We're going to read three parts of chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39, beginning reading verses 2 and 3. It says there, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. Going on and going down just a few verses to verse 9, there is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me. Remember, this is when Joseph was being enticed by Potiphar's wife. Nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And then we read verses 21 through 23. It says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. When we look at why was Joseph able to endure, because he truly had the Lord. He was truly one who walked with the Lord. We read here in verses 2 and 3, we see these phrases pop up. These phrases like the Lord was with Joseph. We see these things like his master saw that the Lord was with him. It wasn't just that the Lord was with Joseph and he was hiding in the background of Joseph's life. But we see that it manifested itself in Joseph to the point where others saw that the Lord was with him. How was he able to get through these things? Because he saw this. Because when we look in verse 9 and we see his response to Potiphar's wife, and he says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He recognized that the Lord was with him. He recognized that he didn't want to sin against God because he didn't want separation from God. It's amazing how much we see of that with Joseph. How he was able to endure, because when we look, even when he was in the prison, we see the same thing. We see where it tells us the Lord was with Joseph. We see where it tells us because the Lord was with him again. And then we see where it tells us because the Lord made it prosper. Joseph had the Lord. When you look at those in the Old Testament, oftentimes we see because they walked with the Lord. We see that phrase for us as well today, and that is something we can say that Joseph did. Because he let it be in him. But you know what? We can look at Joseph all day long. We really could, because it's amazing what he went through. But let's take our application. Let's look at the application for us, because we have brick walls, and we're not always as strong as Joseph. Are we? I'm not. First to admit, I'm not. So what are our brick walls? Turn over to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 13. I have a lot of the verses up here this morning. I know I don't always do that, but I'm trying something different. Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 13. When we read here, remember, this is often referred to in Hebrews 11 as the hall of faith, right? So many examples. So this is who it's talking about here when it says these all died in faith. It's talking about men like Abraham and Enoch and Abel and Moses and all of these great men who died in faith. It says these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. First of all, do we know what it means that we're strangers and pilgrims on this earth? It means that we're aliens on this earth. It means that I don't belong on this earth. When we see this word stranger, it means that we have hospitality from somebody else while we're on this earth. Who is that? God. We get to receive the hospitality of God. We get to receive these things while we're on this earth that He made for us. But this is not our home. And then it goes on and it uses the word pilgrims. And that's just really reinforcing this idea. We are sojourners here. We're strangers here. We don't belong here. It's so important for us to recognize that, because as humans, we have an innate desire to want to be accepted by things, don't we? Anybody here ever want to be accepted by other people? Yeah. And that goes into even when we're out with those who are committing immoral acts. Sometimes we find ourselves wanting to be accepted by them, and I don't even know why. But you know what? That's one of the things that we can hit. That's one of those walls that we can hit in our life. Where we sit there and we forget that I'm a stranger here. We forget that I don't want to be a part of this world. And that I really want to be at home with God. But you know what? What about some smaller brick walls? Because that's kind of a big one, right? Well, what about some smaller things? What about our desires that we have? Potiphar's wife tried to use this desire with Joseph against him. Joseph didn't let that happen. She tried to find these shortcomings. She couldn't find things wrong with Joseph anyways. But when we look at this, what we see is that, well, what's my desires? You see up there it says, is blank. And it's literally a blank. Is blank hindering me? We're going to think about this. And I don't want you to really think hard right now because, well, I want you to keep listening. But I want us to think about this later on, because we need to look at our life and say, is this desire or is this shortcoming? Is my anger hindering me? I'll tell you, I'll be the first one to admit, I sometimes have issues a little bit with my anger. Brittany knows this. She helps me with this. You know what? Is that hindering me in my life? Is that a brick wall that I have yet to overcome? Is jealousy in my life something I've yet to overcome? Is pride something in my life? And the list can go on and on. But you know what? In order for us to know this, in order for us to know if these are something in our life that's causing these things, we have to be able to examine our life, don't we? We have to be able to sit down and look at our own life and say, what is my brick wall? What are these things that I'm going to have to overcome in my life? Turn over to 2 Corinthians, the 13th chapter and verse 5. Paul, writing to the church at Corinth there, he says, examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourself. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you are disqualified. Examine yourself. Test yourself. What's he saying? Look for your faults. Look for those things in our life that are indeed going to hinder us. But when we sit down and we look at ourselves, remember when it tells us that it's so easy to see the speck in somebody else's eye when we can't even see the own beam in ours, right? But you know what? Sit down and look and find out, because we will only be able to discern our brick walls. We'll only be able to discern these things if we're open and honest with ourselves. And I don't know how hard that is for everybody else, but sometimes that's hard for me to do too. Sometimes it's hard to be honest with yourself about what is your shortcomings. I'm lucky. I've never really had a job interview. So that question when they ask you, what's your strengths and weaknesses? I've never really had to answer that. But you know what? I wish I had, because maybe I would actually be a little bit better at that. You know what? When we finally are able to sit down and figure out what our shortcomings are, what our brick walls are, how are we going to come over them? How are we going to overcome them? How are we going to take that sledgehammer and break it away? Well, one of the first things, we're going to go back to a little bit what Mike was talking about last week, what we talked about a little bit the week before that, because right now it's important for us to remember that. Lean on each other. Be able to let one another help us. Over in James, the 5th chapter, in verse 16, it says, confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective and fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. You know, this doesn't just tell me that I need to tell other people, confessing my trespasses to them. This tells me something else. It tells me that I'm going to have trespasses in my life. And the reality of it is that we have all sinned. We know that. We have times in our life where it's hard for us to continue on. But we need to be able to let one another know. Because how are we going to be able to lean on one another if they don't know what's going on in our life? How are they going to accomplish what we're told here in James, to pray for one another, if they don't know what to pray for? The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Let each other know. But you know what? Sometimes we're actually doing what's right. That's what we see with those in Thessalonica. Paul wrote to them here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Verse 11, he's writing to them and he's telling them this. He says, therefore comfort each other and edify one another, just as you also are doing. He is saying, you're doing a good job at this. You go look up a little bit further, they're talking about the fact that they're trying to stay out of darkness and they're trying to stay being the light. And Paul tells them, you're doing a good job. Comfort one another. Why? Because even if they're doing a good job, we still need that comfort. We still need to be able to lean on each other. We still need to be able to let each other know what's going on in our life. And we need to be able to do this because Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17 tells us, iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Mike's lesson was over this. It was over the power in the gathering that we have. You know why there's power? Because we're able to do exactly what it says in Proverbs and sharpen one another up. To help one another. Build one another up. Study with one another. something we need to be more willing to do each and every day. And we need to be able to do it because we need to see that I don't really matter that much. Mike's mentioned this too. And he said this, he said, God's first, everybody else is second, and I'm third. You know what? We need to make sure that we see this, that God is indeed first, and that this tells us right here, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in loneliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. We need to look out for one another. Anybody here in their mind thinking, okay, Jason, you're beating a dead horse? Because if I am, good. Good, because it means you're listening. It means I'm listening. It means I know that this is getting through because I had to know this. This is something I need to be reminded of now. But not only do we need to be reminded that we're able to help one another, we're able to lean on one another, but let's look at Joseph. Let's be like Joseph. Let that word dwell in us richly. Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verse 16. We often turn over here when we talk about why we do a cappella singing, right? But let's read here. Let's read here just for a second, beginning in verse 12. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, and the list goes on. What's it talking about? It's talking about the characteristics of the new man. As the beloved, as the elect, let's put this on. And then it goes down in verse 16. It says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. How are we able to endure these things? Well, we're able to endure them when we let this word dwell in us. But the only way we're able to do that is when we sacrifice our old man. When we put to death the old man. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. That's a song that the kids sing. I love that song. It's hard for me not to sing that verse. But man, I hope that we remember that. I hope we remember it's only possible for us to overcome these things when we no longer want them to be a part of our life. When we no longer want them to be something that we dwell on or something that we turn back on and say, well, I've only got this one vice and that's okay. No. That's something we need to get rid of in our life. Turn over to Ephesians, the 3rd chapter. We're not going to read all of here between verses 14 and 19, but we see here in verse 14, it says, for this reason I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Recognize first off, Paul is praying for the Ephesians. He's praying for those in Ephesus, and he goes on when we read here in verse 19. It says, to know that the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all fullness of God. If you read through there, and I ask you to please read through there. But what we see happening here is Paul is praying that they have a deeper commitment with God. He wants them to become deeper with God. He wants them to become closer to God. And the only way that's possible is through what? Study. The only way that's possible is through what? Leaning on God. Putting our trust in God. But as I mentioned, it's only possible if we open up our Bibles, if we study with one another, if we're willing to do these things. But the Hebrew writer sits here and he rebukes those who haven't. He rebukes those who haven't opened up and studied and gone from needing milk to needing solid food. Here in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12. It says, For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full of age, that is, those who by reason have used their senses to exercise and discern both good and evil. How do we overcome these brick walls, these evil things in our life? Lean on God, study the Word, and know it. No longer be the one who just needs the milk, but be the one who's ready for solid food.